Are young Americans really worse off than their parents and grandparents, or is Scott Galloway just spinning a sensationalist tale for views? NYU professor Scott Galloway, also known as Prof G, recently set the internet ablaze with his provocative TED Talk claiming that the young in America today
they're doing more poorly than previous generations.
But can we trust that Prof G is telling us the truth? As an economist and ex-university lecturer who tracks macroeconomic trends like this for a living, I was intrigued and also pretty skeptical when I first saw this video, where Galloway presents a slew of charts as evidence that 1. Young people today earn less, 2. They face higher costs, and 3. They experience lower well-being compared to previous generations. Finally, to put the icing on the cake, if you will, Professor G even suggests that this is not an accident. It is all due to an
unbelievable transfer of goodwill, of well-being, and of prosperity from young to old.
So when concerned viewers asked me to fact-check this TED Talk, I dove deep into his charts and calculations, comparing them with data from leading experts about generational wealth in America. Surprisingly, my investigation revealed that while Galloway addresses valid concerns, the quality of his TED Talk is not what I expected from a university professor, mainly because he conveniently only uses evidence to support his narrative, shows us charts that mean something else than what he claims, and he frequently leaves out crucial opposing data. So to find out which of Galloway's charts are misleading and what crucial evidence he conveniently leaves out, let's dive into each of these arguments now, starting with Prof G's main argument that young people earn less than previous generations if we correct for inflation. To back up his claim, Professor G shows us 3 main pieces of evidence. The first is that
essentially, as we go down generations, we're seeing that for the last 2 generations, people are making less money on an inflation-adjusted basis.
Where Prof G shows us this slide, which shows us pre-tax income at 25 years for 3 different generations: grandparents, parents, and kids. Evidence number 2 comes from a study by Harvard professor Ray Chetty and colleagues that was published in the prestigious journal Science. This study finds that from 1940 to 2016, the percentage of people that earned more than their parents at the age of 30 drops to about 50%. Finally, evidence number 3 is not about income, it is about wealth, where according to Prof G,
people over the age of 70 used to control 19% of household income versus people under the age of 40 used to control 12%. Their wealth has been cut in half. This isn't by accident, it's purposeful.
So based on this evidence, which clearly shows that generations are earning less and less and have less wealth, Prof G concludes that
this is a breakdown in the fundamental agreement we have with any society, and it creates rage and shame.
And yeah, of course, that sounds very logical, but is Prof G's evidence actually any good? That is it somewhat scientific in the sense that it represents strong evidence from multiple studies, or did he just cherry-pick evidence to sell us his message? If we start with evidence number 1, we can immediately see a big red flag. The source for this table is Prof G's calculations, but Prof G doesn't tell us anything about these calculations other than that he chose to compare income at the arbitrary age of 25, which is in itself a bit suspicious given that previous generations typically did not go to college and therefore tended to earn more at such a young age. Of course, in the spirit of the social sciences, I sent Prof G an email asking for his sources and calculations. However, sadly, he did not respond. Therefore, given that we do not know anything about Prof G's calculations, this piece of evidence is simply not valid. Luckily, Prof G's remaining piece of evidence that should show that younger generations earn less is a very reputable study by Harvard professor Ray Chetty and colleagues that was published in the prestigious journal Science. Indeed, this study almost finds that
for the first time in the US's history, a 30-year-old is no longer doing as well as his or her parents were at 30.
More precisely, the study still finds that 50% of children born in 1984, so these are early millennials, earn more than their parents did when they were 30. But the trend was clear and very worrying. So yes, well-known research in a from a good journal by a respected author, these are all good signs because it means that the study has been seen and examined by a lot of people, and overall it seems to hold up. However, it is just one study, and typically in the social sciences we'd like to have multiple credible studies before we accept something as, potentially true. Sadly, Prof G only cites this one study, so I went to look for other recent studies that shared this finding that young people today earn less than their parents. But this was quite difficult, probably because to get all of this data for each generation earned over time, well, that's a lot of work. Nonetheless, I did find two credible recent studies. The first, this study from Economist from the Federal Reserve that compares both average and median incomes across generations for multiple ages, but with a focus on ages 36 to 40. And the second, this study published by the National Bureau of Economic Research, NBER for short, which looks at average and median income, consumption and wealth across generations with a focus on ages 26 to 34. In contrast to Prof G's cited evidence, both of these other studies find that while progress between generations has slowed down, new generations still earn more than those before them. So are these studies right, and is Prof G's evidence wrong? No. In fact, both of these studies cite Prof Chetty's study with respect and don't claim that their result invalidate that study. So why are then these conclusions so different? Well, I found three big differences between these studies which can explain this quite radically different conclusion. Firstly, the Chetty study cited by Prof G looks at a very specific age and a relatively young age, 30, while the other two studies look at ages above 30 as well. 30 is probably more representative than 25, which Prof G looked at. However, it still suffers from the same problem to a certain extent, which is that younger generations stay in school longer and therefore start their careers later in life. Secondly, the Chetty study looks at income before taxes and transfers, while the Federal Reserve study looks at both income before and after taxes and transfers. And while the Fed study finds that for both of these measures, 36 to 40-year-olds are better off today, they also find that taxes and transfers help improve the situation of young people today, which could contribute to the more negative result of the Chetty study for people at 30 years old. Finally, the Chetty study just looks at whether or not children earn more than their parents, while the other two studies look at average and median incomes across generations. This could make a big difference if inequality in America increased over time, which it did. To see why, just imagine a simple scenario where 5 children earn a little bit less than their parents, while 5 children earn a lot more. In this case, the Chetty study outcome would be that American prosperity is slowing down. However, the other researchers would find that both the average and median incomes have still improved. But while generations are still better off in these two other studies, all three of them find evidence that growth between generations is slowing down. For example, while the Federal Reserve study finds that the real median income of millennials was 18% higher than that of Gen X, at the same age, it reports that boomers did 27% better than the generation that came before them. On top of that, the Fed study reports that the higher income of younger people may be skewed by the fact that they are increasingly living with and relying on their parents well into their 20s. Finally, while the NBER study finds that on average and at the median, young Americans are doing better than previous generations, this is not the case for the poorest in US society, where progress has stagnated. So in short, the second piece of evidence given to us by Prof G is valid. However, for a university professor, it is really quite disappointing that he only picks a single study that seems to confirm his point, while ignoring the other recent respectable studies that go against it. Luckily, Prof G still has a third piece of evidence, which is this chart that clearly shows that there has been
an enormous transfer of wealth, where people over the age of 70 used to control 19% of household income versus people under the age of 40 used to control 12. Their wealth has been cut in half.
But does this chart really show that there has been an enormous transfer of wealth from young to old? No, it doesn't. Instead, it probably shows us that America has gotten older. You see, to make this chart, Prof G used this data from the Federal Reserve. This data shows the total wealth controlled by 4 different age groups in America. To see why this is not proof that there has been a transfer of wealth from young to old, let's assume that everyone just has a constant level of wealth. They do not get richer. Now assume that there is a really big generation of Americans that is bigger than the generation before them and bigger than the generation after them. The second assumption is true. There is a group like this in America, and they are called the baby boomers. Now, this chart here shows that in the year 2000, baby boomers were between the ages of 35 and 54. In 2010, they were between 45 and 64 years old, and in 2020, they were between 55 and 74. Now, as you can see in the Federal Reserve graph, from 1990 to 2010, when most baby boomers pass the age of 40, the under 40s lose a lot of wealth. Then from 2000 to 2020, the 40 to 54-year-old category loses a lot of wealth. And then finally, from 2010 to 2020, the people above 70 seem to control more and more wealth. Is that a coincidence? I doubt it. Indeed, if we go back to Prof. G's chosen years of 1989 and 2023, we can calculate that in 1989, baby boomers were younger than 40. But in 2023, quite a few baby boomers were already older than 70. So while I admit that one explanation for Prof. G's graph could indeed be that there has been a massive wealth transfer from young to old, a simpler explanation could just be that a really large generation, the baby boomers, just got older. What likely makes this effect even bigger is that as people get older, they build wealth. So if a really big generation gets old people overall will of course control more wealth. So in short, Prof. G's third piece of evidence is not evidence at all because it can show us multiple things. Luckily, the NBER study that I mentioned reported that young Americans still earn more than previous generations did. They did a proper study on wealth across these generations per person. However, in line with their findings about income, the NBER study finds that younger generations are also still a bit wealthier than those before them, even though, quite worryingly, wealth inequality in America has increased a lot. So in short, Prof. G's evidence to support his claim that younger generations are worse off than those before them is very weak. His first piece of evidence only looks at the age of 25 and is based on his own calculations that we cannot verify. Just as bad, his third piece of evidence really does not prove that there has been a massive transfer of wealth because it could simply show that America got older. And while this second piece of evidence is certainly valid, it's pretty suspicious that Prof. G only quotes one of the 3 respectable recent studies about this subject. But luckily for Prof. G, he might still be right that the young today are worse off than those before them, because even if they earn more and are still a bit more wealthy, they could still be worse off because, according to Prof. G, life is more expensive for the young today. Because while the income and wealth calculations from the previous section have already taken into account inflation in general, as Prof. G says,
the cost of buying a home, the cost of pursuing education continues to skyrocket.
This disproportionately affects the young since they are the ones that still need to buy an education or need to buy their first home. But are these effects really so bad that they offset the fact that young generations are still earning more than previous generations? In his talk, Prof. G does not give us any evidence that it does. He just mentions that an education is now much more expensive than it was when he was young. On top of that, he tells us that it's now more difficult to get into a good college. Both of this is true. And yeah, I think it's really good that Prof. G calls our attention to this because it is clearly a big problem. However, he does again leave out 2 pieces of more optimistic evidence that run counter to his narrative. The first is that even though colleges today accept a lower percentage of applications, they still accept way more applications than when Prof. G was young. Indeed, as you can see here, younger generations are more educated than those that came before them, a trend that is, according to Pew Research, holding up for Generation Z so far. He also doesn't tell us that luckily for our children, the terrible trend that colleges got way more expensive has recently turned a corner, as we can see here in this graph from the College Board. Finally, while one study is not enough evidence to be sure, the Fed study that I mentioned earlier does find that the extra income younger generations earn is more than enough to cover the increased cost of education, because these increased costs are typically only incurred for a couple of years, while the financial benefits of an education accrue over decades. So while I think Prof. G is right to talk about America's increased education costs and competitiveness of education as a serious problem for young people, he does not provide us with any serious evidence to show how bad it really is, and he leaves out some hopeful trends for our children, such as more people getting an education and costs falling in the last few years again. This worrying trend of cherry-picking data continues, sadly, when he talks about America's housing problem. To be clear, as I discussed in my video about housing, the exploding cost of housing is a very serious problem for younger generations. It could even explain why young generations are living longer with their parents, as reported by Fed researchers. However, what Prof. G leaves out is that, as you can see here in this graph, while house prices went up by a lot, interest rates went down by a lot. Of course, there is one notable exception, which is after the pandemic in 2022 and 2023, when interest rates shot up while house prices kept rising. Interest rates are really important because what matters for most people is not just the cost of a home, but rather the cost of a mortgage payment, which is heavily influenced by both house prices and interest rate. Prof. G knows this very well because he states that
pre-pandemic, the average mortgage payment was $1,100. It's now $2,300 because of an acceleration in interest rates and the fact that the average home has gone from $290,000 to $420,000.
But isn't it a bit suspicious that he shows us a long historical graph starting in 1985 when interest rates were really high and home prices low, but then he only looks at 2019 and 2024 for the mortgage cost comparison? If he wanted to present a more nuanced picture, he would have instead relied on research here, which shows that if you take into account both home prices and interest rates, house affordability was very bad in the 1980s when interest rates were super high, and in the early 2000s when the US was in the middle of a housing bubble, but where actually, it got a bit better in the 2010s thanks to super low interest rates and lower house prices after the crash in 2007. However, as you can see here, it does not feel that way right now because both interest rates and house prices are now very high. And that is not fair to the Gen Zers who are now joining the housing market. But it does not fit with Prof. G's story that housing just got worse for every generation. What he could have presented though is this chart, which shows that despite earning more, Gen X has a lower home ownership rate than boomers, and millennials have a lower home ownership rate than Gen X at a similar age. And while Gen Z had a promising start, the post-pandemic surge in interest rates and home prices might spoil that. So again, here my conclusion is that while Prof. G is speaking about two very big problems in America that hit younger generations especially hard, he has not shown us any evidence that this offsets the general finding that young people generally still earn a little bit more than the generations before them. Therefore, it also does not prove that there has been a massive transfer of wealth from young to old. But what about Prof. G's argument that
it would cost $11 billion to expand the child tax credit, but that gets stripped out of the infrastructure bill. But the additional $135 billion a year to Social Security, that flies right through Congress.
Or that
for the last 40 years, capital has been kicking the shit out of labor. Well, you think, whoa, what about wages, right? They've gone up. Well, if you compare them to the S&P, they barely register. It's been an amazing time to own assets.
Or quite a few similar arguments about Harvard not accepting many more people, or that the top tax rate's down since the 1970s, or that senior poverty is way down while child poverty is roughly stable. Well, some of these arguments are good and some of them are very bad. But more importantly, despite Scott Galloway branding himself as Prof. G, there's really nothing academic about these arguments. He's just giving us random examples of transfers from young to old without giving us any insight into how big these transfers are and whether or not they are offset by other big transfers the other way around, such as, for example, 45 to 65 years old people paying the largest share of taxes in the US. Indeed, the fact that the Fed study found that the income of younger generations looks better after taxes and transfers suggests that the transfer from old to young could be bigger than the transfer from young to old. In his defense though, Prof G was convinced by this one study that young people are worse off in America, so in that case it did make sense to just mention a few examples of why that could be the case. But now that we have seen that it is not proven at all that this is the case, these arguments about a massive transfer just look like random examples which do not prove at all that there has been an
unbelievable transfer of goodwill, of well-being, and of prosperity from young to old
in America. However, even if it doesn't look like young people are poorer than previous generations, could Prof G still be right about his final point that today young people have lower well-being and happiness? To back up this claim, Prof G shows us
a bunch of graphs all headed up into the right.
The first graph shows us that self-harm rates among children from 10 to 14 have exploded, especially amongst girls. The second is that teens and especially girls are increasingly depressed. Then, young people and especially men are having less sex. Cumulative gun deaths are way up for very young children. Youngsters are more obese, and finally in this depressing list, overdose deaths among the young are way up. Even if younger generations are better off materially, this will convince any human being with a heart that the world is a dark place for today's youth, right? No. Again, Prof G's charts are to my knowledge correct, but they are also again very selective, meaning that much like a politician, Prof G just looks at what he wanted to push as a story and then went out finding only graphs that support that point, while ignoring others that don't. However, if we take a more scientific approach and take a look at the key national indicators of child well-being from the US Federal Interagency Forum on Child and Family Statistics, long name, we can also find many important graphs that remain fairly stable, like child poverty, which Prof G briefly mentioned in his talk. But if we want to sell a story that kids are better off than their parents, we may also find many graphs that show that the life of children got better, such as less air pollution, less asthma, less water pollution, less lead in the blood of children, less youth victims of serious violent crimes, and more young adults finishing high school. Where you may have noticed that I selected 6 graphs that go against Prof G's point to prove a point, which is that Prof G is not acting like a prof in this video, but rather like a politician trying to push a certain message. Now, that message may resonate with you. Actually, a big part of that message resonates with me, given that I myself have made videos addressing the housing crisis in the Anglo-Saxon world, or the fact that due to stagnant wages and inflation, the US economy may look great on paper, but really does not work for a lot of people. However, this video was never about trying to sell you a message. It was about trying to find out if Prof G is acting like a prof, trying to uncover a nuanced truth, or as a politician trying to sell you a story. And there my conclusion is that Prof G's evidence for his main point that the young in America are doing more poorly than previous generations is very, very weak. Yes, extensive studies suggest that the rate of progress has decreased, that lower income people are no longer progressing, and that many people don't do as well as their parents. But both looking at the average and median current generations are still earning more than the generations before them. And there is no evidence that this is offset by increasingly expensive homes and colleges. No solid evidence that there is a big wealth transfer from young to old, and there is no evidence that kids today are overall worse off than the generations before them, even though they have face some very big problems. Therefore, my conclusion, purely based on this TED Talk, is that Prof G is an interesting speaker, and his data is generally correct, even though he sometimes interprets it the wrong way. However, he acts more like a politician than a professor, often presenting only evidence that confirms the message that he is pushing, rather than providing us with a more nuanced state of research, which I would have expected from a professor. But yeah, this is just how it came across to me, because while I did reach out for comment to Prof G's NYU email address as well as his team, before publishing this video, I did not receive a response. Hopefully he will still do so in the comments of this video. Lastly, I want to note that to keep this video watchable for the general YouTube audience, I wanted to stick to Prof G's main arguments and main pieces of evidence that supported it. But of course, I went through all of his evidence, and for each graph about transfers from young to old, I made a judgment call whether or not it was any good, and whether or not it was part of his main argument or just a Side note. This is just how YouTube works, folks. I try to make my videos brief and to the point enough, such that it can be enjoyed by most. However, if you really love debunking and want to get an exclusive insight into how I make these decisions, which point to include and which to leave out, or if you want to make sure I did not cherry pick my points, I heartily recommend checking out my brief, exclusive follow-up video on Nebula, Economist nitpicks Scott Galloway's anti-boomer TED Talk, a nerdy video in which I go through all of Prof G's graphs about wealth transfers from young to old, many of which are very flawed or irrelevant, from which we can actually learn a lot. But it just didn't fit into this video. On top of watching that video, Nebula viewers can watch all of my videos ad-free in Nebula's new news page, and some of my videos, such as this one and the previous video about India, could be viewed a couple of days early on Nebula before they were released on YouTube. So if you're interested in my nerdy video fact-checking Scott's additional graphs, watch all of my content early without ads, and importantly, if you want to support these types of fact-checking videos, then please sign up to Nebula using my link nebula.tv/moneymacro or the link in the description to get the Nebula annual plan for 40% off, which translates to just $2.5 per month.